Good evening. We unfortunately lost last Wednesday's Bible study due to a technical glitch. Weren't able to get a recording out of the session, and so I thought I'd just put together this little thing here to try to serve as a bridge between the information, the study from where we were the week before to where we will be this coming Wednesday. I didn't want that gap to be in there, so hence this. So what we're going to do in this little session is I'll read you the scripture passage that we dealt with in that Wednesday we weren't able to record, and then just deal as quickly as I can in a somewhat abbreviated fashion with the material that we covered, at least the highlights of it, and hopefully that will keep us all in the same place, on the same page, so to speak. So, having said that, let's look to the Word of God. This is out of the book of Romans, chapter 1, and verse 28 to 32. This is what it says there. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. And may God add his blessing to the reading of his word. Now, in this particular passage of Scripture, we have the conclusion of the Apostle Paul's remarks concerning the topic of depravity. What we look at in this passage that we look at tonight is really filling out the broader spectrum of depravity and dealing with the subject matter, which goes back to verse number 21. We really see three different levels or three different aspects to depravity that were dealt with throughout those verses. We've looked at the first two, tonight's the last one, so I'll talk about the whole picture here for a little bit, that whole logical package, if you will, of dealing with depravity. Now, in each of those sections, what we see is that depravity is presented as the misuse of a God-given ability, which led to a darkening of that ability, and the darkening of that ability led to depravity of some sort. Now, in the first of those levels or aspects, we saw in verses 21 through 23 that the God-given ability of perception, particularly a perception of God, the ability to see, to perceive him, to know what God truly was in a very personal kind of a way, that ability was misused. They did not, even though they knew God, they did not honor him or thank him, and they moved because they misused their perception of God. That moved them into God backing out of the picture, so to speak, and a darkening as a result coming upon them. That ability was darkened, and that darkened ability then expresses itself in some sort of depravity. So the first level was perception to misperception. They went from the ability to know and understand God as he is to not knowing what God is like. And this is most tangibly represented in the fact that, they started making up fairy tales about God. They started carving out images and idols of God. They started, taking their own best shot about what they think God would be like or should be like, all of those kinds of things. The second level was desire to defilement. This verses 24 through 27, where the God-given ability to desire um, was misused, and in the misusing of that ability, um, the depravity became defilement. Now, desire was for created things. I think that the probably the easiest and most central aspect or feature of that would be sexual. Um, our mates are created beings, and the instrumentalities of sexual relations are part of the created order, and all of that was blessed by God with desire. The desire for your mate is not, there's nothing intrinsically evil or wrong about that. It's a God-given feature, I think, that helps us to be fruitful and multiply. However, that desire was misused, and it led to all kinds of defilement of creation, defilement of our bodies with one another. Remember talking about that, I hope. Desire to defilement. Not just there, though. I mean, I think that there's a broader aspect to this as well, and that is, just an over enamoration with the created order, so that we become, naturalists. We become animists. We become, superstitious about Mother Earth, those kinds of things. And I think that it even has to do with things like gluttony, like appetites of that nature. Desires, God-given, but they were misused, right? Misused in the sense that God was, kicked out of the picture, didn't want to hear about what God wanted in these areas. God steps back, the light's out of the image of man in these areas. Darkness is the result, and out of that darkness comes just, out of the willfulness of the nature that we've been given, depravity of every sort. And so that was in that area. And this area tonight deals with the God-given ability to have knowledge, particularly knowledge of everything, but from the standpoint of seeing it through God's eyes, having God in it. We often talk about worldview. I think that this is something very, very associated, very akin, very germane to the subject, is that with God in our ability of knowing, and our ability of reasoning, our ability to seeing things and understanding them, if God's out of that, and we didn't, we'll talk about how we kicked him out, but when God's not in our knowing, then our knowing becomes darkened, and the result of that is the depravity of failed reason. So here's the pairs that these verses about depravity develop for us: perception to misperception, desire to defilement, knowledge to failed reason. And when in this last segment, failed reason, when that becomes the depraved condition of us, then what's going to happen is we're going to do improperly. What we do comes out of our thoughts, comes out of our thought life, comes out of our reasoning and our logic and our understanding. When that doesn't have God in it, then the doing, what we will do, will always be improper. It's not going to measure up to the high standard of God. Now, the verses that we looked at tonight tell us how this last level, knowledge to failed reason, actually developed. It said that humans did not approve of retaining God in their hands-on knowledge, in their worldview, in their the way that they reasoned about life. So God gave them up to an unapproved mind. Now, there's a wordplay there. On one hand, we have a word that means approved, and on the other hand, we have a word that means not approved. And these things are, set up side by side. We didn't approve of God being in our mind, so we end up doing things that are not approved by God. And, straightforward and simple enough, I suppose, but I just always love it when these little word plays come into play. The Greek word noon is used referring to the area where this occurs, this level of depravity or aspect of depravity. And really that's all about our reasoning. And when we see that depravity has affected our reason, because reason, the way that we reason, affects everything in life. You can see why maybe this last area, depravity, seems to be so much broader than those that were taken up in the prior verses. Now, the result of this depravity, as I said, this level of depravity is that getting God out of the way we look at things, we end up doing things that are not fitting. They're not fitting. How? They're not fitting before God, who is the one who knows and judges. Thoughts without God will always lead to behavior that's not right with God. If God's not in our mind, then our behavior is going to be ungodly, and that's really what is being demonstrated in this particular development. Now, what does it say specifically how this depravity worked itself out? Well, we kicked God out of our reasoning. We didn't approve of God thoughts being in the midst of our reasoning about things, So, as a result, we were filled to the brim, and that's exactly the word that's used. It means filled to the brim, even overflowing with every kind of things, every kind of various things. Now, the interesting thing about this development is that grammatically, there's three different lists here, and the list are dealt with by different cases that basically associate each little group with the improper doing in a certain way. Okay, so the first of the list are all in the dative case, and so what that means is that these things are meant to be considered the means by which that action of doing, we talked about the improper doing, that improper doing, the means of which that improper doing got brought forth is represented by this first list, and that is unrighteousness. So, there was unrighteousness in the thoughts, and wickedness in the thoughts, and avariciousness in the thoughts, and malice in the thoughts. These are the words that are used in this first series, and they represent the means by which all that improper doing got carried out when the light of God is not in the way that we think, not in the way that we look at things. Then the way that we look at things is going to be dominated by unrighteousness, wickedness, avariciousness, malice. And when maybe we could say those kinds of things, let's call them motivations, when those are the kinds of things moving within the fabric of developing thoughts and intents, bad things are going to result. And I think that's the picture here. Then now the second list, it talks about us being full of, and it's just a general word for being full. It doesn't have the color of the first word talking about being full. That was full to overflowing. This is just full. These words that are in this list are all in the genitive case. So what that means is they are from the action of doing. So we have the motivation for the improper doing, and then we have the actual things that come from that doing. And what are they? Envy, murder, strife, deceit, malignity. These are all listed, of course, in verse number 28 as well, the second list. And so we see how this depravity in this area of the way that we think, our reasoning, our worldview, this depravity in this area, we can see how it develops. Something that's a little deeper, motivationally perhaps, begins because it doesn't have the light of God in it, begins to push our thoughts and our considerations in a certain way, which leads to things being, maybe we could say, more fully born in our thoughts and in our intents. That's what we see in this second area. And then finally, we see a third list. And in this third list, all of these things are in the accusative. And so these are what we'd say the objects, or maybe we can say the final products of the to-do. So that improper doing, all of these things being in the accusative, these are the outcomes. These are the final things to which those things are leading to. These things are going to be much more general, and I think we'll see that when we just name all the list again. They're much more general, and in some respects, they can even seem to be much more, they don't seem to be so virulent. Some of them are, others don't seem like they're all that bad. But I always think that it's instructional when we see these kinds of things in some of these more minor areas. They're listed in several times throughout the New Testament, always spoken of in very stark terms, very scary terms. We don't think of these things as, we're just all human beings doing our thing, right? And we don't think of these things at the same way, or in the same way that God does. We think, that these are minor character flaws, or just, traits of being human, because some of these things are, they're not necessarily something that's going to kill somebody or injure somebody, things of that nature. And so, we think of them as something more minor. However, when we look at the way that they're presented in lists like this and in other lists in the New Testament, we see God doesn't see them that way. God is deadly serious about these things, and these things represent something that is an expression that's totally against and without Him. So it's an eye-opening experience when you get a little picture of how differently God thinks about things than we do. Our thoughts are not His thoughts. Our ways are not His ways. And things like this, I think, kind of give us a cold slap to the face, wake us up to just the nature of our own brokenness. And not to say it again, but why not, our own depravity. What are these objects in the accusative that we're talking about? Well, the list is gossips, okay, and that means whisperers. Again, we tease about that in church life even. We don't think of it being bad. God thinks of it as being terrible. Slanderers. So that's pretty bad. We don't necessarily think that's awful. But, God looks at that and sees it as a terrible thing. God haters. Well, that makes sense, right? I mean, that makes you an enemy of God. Insulters. We have, well, we used to when I was young anyhow, we used to have comedians who made a life insulting people. We thought it was funny, right? God doesn't think that's funny. Arrogant. Boasters. Sometimes those things go together, right? But, whatever you look at it, some of these things, again, they may be, lesser qualities, but we don't necessarily think of them as being expressions of depravity. Well, guess what? They don't have the light of God. They're not coming from the light of God, and so they represent the darkness of a human will that doesn't have God in it. Okay, and so terrible. Boasters, inventors of evil. It's a wonderful thing that we're creative, that we are absolutely just ingenious, and yet that God-given ability ends up being something that just works for always producing the evil rather than the good. Disobedient to parents. We think that's just, human nature. It's just a rite of passage. God doesn't see it that way. We think the generation gap is, just a thing. God thinks it's an evil thing. Disobedient to parents, foolish. Again, do we think of being foolish in the same way that God does, of having empty thoughts, having having things that make for no benefit to somebody else? We think those things are what, mistakes, human nature, character traits. God sees them as an expression of our darkness without Him, being untrustworthy, being hard-hearted, being compassionless. I mean, we see how broad this list is. It's dealing with much more general terms what we are as human beings. And what this is telling us is that these particular aspects are not minor things. They're really, in some sense, a manifestation of the fact that we don't have God inside of us. And so, though we are made in the image of God, when God's not inside the image of God, what comes out of that is darkness, the darkness of depravity, and this is how it's defined and described here. Now, I think that that probably gets us more or less up to date on things that represent the core of what we needed to get across. So with that, I'll end this thing and wish you a very good night.